Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. If you can't hear me, just let me know, because sometimes I can be a little too quiet. This is the Around the Views in 20-minute session. This is targeted really at site builders as sort of an intro session to views. I'm Gwen Daniels. I'm the Director of Technology Development at Illinois Legal Aid Online. We are a nonprofit here in Chicago. We use technology to help people who can't afford attorneys solve their own legal problems. I'm fairly new to Drupal. I've been working with it for about a year. We are actually migrating our websites away from Cold Fusion to Drupal over the next 12 months. We've been working on the rebuild now for about 6 months. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what views are and how to set them up. Some things that have gotten me into trouble over the last, as I've worked with them, and a couple of things that we found that actually made them a little bit, to make our views a little bit better. So first, let's start with what is views. It's a module. Views and Views UI will allow you to create essentially a list of content. And this is sort of the screen where you would actually go in and add a view. You get to it by going into Structure Views. You pick your content type, whether you want an actual node type, users, taxonomy, comments, and then you can pick what, how you want the content to be displayed, as a grid, a list, a table. And then you can go through and pick fields or just save and continue. And that really takes you to the screen where all of the view action in views really happens, is in these 3 columns. And I'm going to talk mostly about stuff in the first 2 columns, starting with fields. Now, you don't have to use fields in your view. You can do views of full content. You can do views of teasers. But I find that I tend to use views that are more field-oriented than anything else. If you're creating a view of content, Drupal will put in just the content title and nothing else by default. If you're doing users, it'll put the username. If you click the Add button, you can then add any other field that's associated with the content that you're using. If you click on the little arrow, down arrow, it'll give you the option to rearrange your fields, and you can move things up and down. And depending on what your format is, if you're using a table, Drupal will lay out all of your fields in a single row. If you're using list or grids, it'll put it in an up and down list. If you click on the title of any of the fields, it gives you the options to go in and actually configure how it looks. You can do things like create a label or remove the label if you don't want one. You can exclude an item from display, and I'll explain why you might want to do that in a minute. You can add a style class to it. You can handle what happens when there's nothing in that field, and you can rewrite the results. Rewriting results is something that I find that I need to do a lot, because if all of your data is in either a list or a row with everything in its own column, that's not always what you want. And so so if you click on Rewrite Results, you should get something that looks like that. However, if you're using jQuery Update on your website, and you click that little plus sign, that little checkbox, and nothing happens, check your jQuery Update settings, because if you are using a version that is like jQuery 1.8 or above, it breaks the UI. At least that's been my experience. And so I've go in and either use a different jQuery for the admin side, or just lower it down to about 1.7, and then it will work. And then once you've done that, you should see a text field like this, and you can put in HTML, you can put in CSS, you can put in text, and you can put in fields. Like I've got here, I've got a view that was using, it was a staff directory. And so I've got first name, last name, and job title, and I want them all in the same line. And so I've put the fields in there, put a comment and bolded the name. And I got to those by clicking on the little thing that says replacement patterns down there. And then Drupal will tell you what the replacement patterns, the fields that I can use in this particular rewrite, and I just paste them into that text field. Now the only catch with replacement patterns, and it says it right there on the view, and I've never read it, is that the fields that you want to include in the rewrite results have to be above the field that you're actually editing. And that's where the ability to exclude something from display comes in, because if you're rewriting the result to include it in a later field, you might want to exclude it from showing up in another column. Another thing that is pretty common with views is you might want to filter your results. So let's say you don't want everything to show up in the view. By default, Drupal will set for content to only show published content, for users to only show active users. That's not always what you want either, especially if you're doing an administrative view where you might want to just show all the unpublished content. But if you click on the filter, you then have the ability to configure it. And you can pick your option. So this one is looking at published content. I could say, no, I want to see everything. I want to see everything, or show any, or I could say, no, and I'll show all the unpublished content instead of published content. And I can expose it to the user and allow them to pick, which is useful if you want somebody to be able to filter on the front end, to be able to filter a view, or search for somebody by, say you have a user view, filter on it by their name or their email address. And by default, it will put the filters up at the top of your view. And I'm going to show you towards the end some things you can do to make that better. Another thing that you can do is you can put your view on a menu. And by clicking the No menu, there's an option to pick a menu item to add it to. It's also useful if you want to overwrite another menu item. One of the things that we've done is we've used the event registration module to add events to allow people to register for events on our calendar. It comes with a registrations table that has like name and status and not much else. That's not useful to us. We need to know where the person works. We need to know what their job title is sometimes. And so we went and created our own view with all of the fields in the registration that we wanted to be able to see. And then just put the same menu item in the view as what the event registration module was using, and it replaced it without having to write any code. So I did an emergency rebuild of our organizational website 2 weeks ago after our hosting service blew up our old site, which was not written in Drupal. And I created a view of our board of directors. I created each of our board members as a user, and created a view that had their picture, their name, their job title, the company they work with, in their bio. And I thought it looked great. Until my boss comes in and says, this is what she saw on the screen. By default, Drupal will set as a default permission for your view if you're using user profiles, the permission of view user profiles. If you're using content, it'll set a permission of view published content. That's not always what you want, and we are not going to let anonymous users view user profiles, but I wanted them to be able to see the board list. So if I go in and click permission next to where it says access, I then have the option to decide whether I want to assign the permission to view the view at a permission or role level, and if I do it at a permission level, I can then pick what permission I want to allow to be able to view that view. And so what we did was just go and change it to view published content, which anonymous users can do. We made sure there was no link in the view to the actual user profile, and then anyone could see our board of directors page. Another thing that we find a need to do a lot is to add either a custom header or a custom footer to our view. Just because sometimes you want to be able to put a total summary at the bottom, or put a link to some help text, or just explain what the view is to the end user. And Views makes that really, really easy by adding header and footer in the center column. You just hit the add button, and then you have the option to add a number of any of a number of different things. You can do a rendered entity, you can do a result summary, you can actually insert another view. Most of the time what we end up doing is a text area where we can just type stuff in. And so if I did a text area, and another thing to catch is if you have multiple pages in your view, multiple displays, that little thing up there that says 4, make sure you're only changing the one that you want to change. So you can do this page override, or you can do all displays, so that you're not messing up something that you may have already done. I've done that many times. But then I can just type into that text box any HTML, CSS, I can put hyperlinks in and text that I might want to show at the top or the bottom, depending on whether it's a header or a footer of my view. Another thing that we have found a real need to do, if you're using views, particularly on the administrative side, if you're using it to create like tables of data, here's a list of all your content, here's a list of all your users. One thing that we find a need to do is to be able to actually take that data and do other things with it outside of the website. For example, we might want to take our list of users and import it into Salesforce. And at this point, we don't have Salesforce integrated into Drupal. We have partners who like to publish things in print versions, even though they're outdated the minute they hit the printer. And so we would like to be able to take stuff from our view and actually export it into a Word document that they can then use. And that's where the Views Data Export module comes in. It is a really easy to use module that will let you export your view in a Word document, as a text file, in Excel, as CSV, or as XML. And once it's installed, all you have to do is go up to the display and hit Add and select Data Export, and it will create a view with it'll have a format, CSV file, settings. If I click on that CSV file, I can pick what format I actually want. So let's say I want XML instead of CSV. All I have to do is change it, and I click the settings, and it will give me settings specific to that file format. So for example, XML, I have the option to write it to the browser or write it to a file. If what you want to do is expose it so that somebody can pull it as a feed, then write it to the browser instead of downloading it as a file. It's a really, really easy thing to do to get your data out of the view and into something else. Another thing that we found is that by default, we don't really like the filters that come with views. So we created a calendar using views, using the calendar type, which automatically creates a view. And we created an event type filter so that people can filter the calendar based on event type. And by default, what Drupal does is puts it up right above the header, right below the header, above the view, and puts it in as a select list with an apply button. And there's a couple of things you can do to make that better. First, you can make your filter a block, which means you can then put it anywhere on the page you want. That is something that you do in the exposed. Under the advanced tab, if you open that up, there's the exposed form. And if you hit no, you can change that to yes, and it'll create a block of your filters, which you can then do whatever you want with. Another thing that we found was a module called Better Exposed Filters that lets us do a bunch of different things with our filter, with our view. And it'll let us do things like replace the drop-downs with a checkbox. Use select all or select none, which is useful if you have a multi-select with 20 items in it. It lets you add help text to your filter so you can explain to the user what they're filtering on. And there is an entire handbook on Drupal.org explaining how to all the functionality of this particular module. But it turned this page into a page that looks like this, where we have drop-downs, checkboxes, and the ability to select all or select none depending on the state. And we think it's an improvement over what we had to start with. Are there any questions or anything that anyone wants to see? There's a ton of other things in views. There's a lot of things in views. This is just sort of a basic intro. Yeah.
You said something earlier, the great sort of access denied one you talked about. Are there any other like gotchas like that for you late at night hit you or somebody told you about the next morning, like, oh yeah, by default we do X or we do Y kinds of things that you want to share?
We had one view that was on our development server and didn't have any permissions on it. which is a little bit of a risk because then anybody can get into it and maybe that's not what you want. We had removed it for some reason because it wasn't showing up and whoever had built it had just removed a permission instead of setting a permission that actually works for everything. At a minimum, you should probably have view published content if you want it to be available to anonymous users, and a more restrictive permission if you only want it to be available to people who have more of an administrative right, or you can limit it by role. We will have some views on our rebuild that will only be available to people who have what we call the super administrator permission or the content manager permission, because they are the only people who should be able to see a report of, say, how old our content in our system currently is and what needs to be reviewed.
So is there any way to permanently set those in views so that every time, I mean, was that a set it and forget it once? I probably wasn't paying attention to you answering this.
I don't know that there's a way to change it so that it applies to every new view you create, but once you set it for a particular view,
so it's
set for that view.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You would inherit all the displays.
Yeah.
To create a view that looks like a front page with a bunch of teasers for a bunch of other nodes.
Yeah.
I couldn't figure out how to do that without adding. I wound up adding a field to the article data type, and then select on for view A, select on field A. For view B, select on field value equals B. Is there a built-in way to do something like the front page without adding something like a...
Well, you can do a view of teasers.
Yeah. But how can this view and that view have a different selection of teasers? How do they know which ones to get?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to have some sort of something to filter on. You would need like a taxonomy term or another field. Like we have two views, one for staff and one for board, and I just created a field that designates whether somebody is a board member or a staff member, and then it pulls those into the two different views in the same display, in the same view with two different displays.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a better way to do that without having some sort of filter. And I'm supposed to remind all of you that the sprint on Sunday is from 9 to 5 here. And like they've been saying, anybody of any skill set or level can attend, and there's plenty of stuff for everybody to do. And finally, you can leave feedback at bit.ly/MidCamp views. And my contact information is up there. And if there's anything I can, any questions or anything, I'm happy to try to answer them if I can. And thank you for coming.